Good morning, this is Angela with Parkrose Permaculture. It is starting to feel a little bit like autumn here in the Pacific Northwest. This morning I took my children to the Portland Japanese garden. We have a membership, and so that way we can get in early in the morning before the general public and just feels like we have the garden to ourselves. It's so quiet and so peaceful, and we all really enjoy going there. If you are in the Pacific Northwest and you have the opportunity to go to the Portland Japanese garden, I hope that you take it. It's one of my favorite places here in the city. I have a video on it from actually earlier in the year talking about it a little bit, so you can check that out here. Now, I spoke in my last video about some of my goals for autumn, right? I'm working on getting my tomatoes to ripen. I was working on pruning back all of my tomato plants to help push them toward ripeness. And the other thing that I've been working on is harvesting beans. So that's what today's video is going to be about. I want to talk a little bit about pole beans as I drop them all over the ground. So today I want to talk a little bit not just about pole beans, but also about setting attainable goals in terms of our gardening, in terms of our permaculture. So why grow pole beans? Well, obviously most gardeners grow bush beans for the lovely green pods that are absolutely delicious. They are legumes and they fix nitrogen as well. Pole beans are a great addition to any garden. I talk a lot about maximizing use of space on this channel. I talk about the different layers of crops that you can grow. I only have 1/4 acre, and that means I really need to utilize vertical space, and pole beans are a great way to do that. Now, I've grown pole beans on any kind of structure, from my fence to bamboo teepees to old crib rails that I got from the dump. Those are a great trellis for peas and beans. And this year I am using a cattle panel trellis that I installed, and that's working out really well. Beans can be a little bit prone to fungal diseases, and I really love that the cattle panel arch provides fantastic air circulation, and I've had no fungal problems at all. I also love the aesthetics of all of the beans hanging on the inside of the arch. It just creates a really beautiful view in my garden as those are growing. I do love to have the aesthetics in my garden feed and nourish me as much as the food. So every year I grow a different kind of pole bean. Obviously, I've repeated some that we really like over the years. I'm a big fan of Sadie's horse bean, which is actually difficult to find now. It's an old heirloom pole bean. Pole beans are, in some climates, able to be perennialized. I've had here in Portland some years where we've had mild winters, where I can actually cut the pole beans back in the fall, mulch them really heavily, and they'll come back next year. I would say you shouldn't rely on that strategy here in Zone 8B. It's typically not successful, but a few times I have had them overwinter and come back in the spring as a pleasant surprise. But usually I plant them out every year a few weeks after I plant out my bush beans. Pole beans like a little bit hotter weather, and they have a little bit longer growing season. So that means they do take up more time, and they occupy space in the garden for longer than other crops. And here in mid-September is when they're starting to ripen up. So I plant them out in early May. If I go any earlier than that, they tend to rot in the ground, or I have problems with squirrels and crows digging them up, and I have problems with slugs eating the very tender green shoots. So the sweet spot for me is like early to mid-May to start out my pole beans. And that means I'm harvesting now in mid-September. So again, I grow a variety of pole beans. We can eat the green pods, but I'm really focused on growing them for soup beans. And there's just such a huge diversity. It's like growing apples, right? There's a huge diversity of beans, and you can get all kinds of flavors and textures and sizes and colors. And so it's really a great fun project to grow a different kind of pole bean, or a few different kinds of pole beans every year. So obviously our family of 6 cannot grow our entire year's worth of beans and pulses that we consume on this 1/4 acre here. That's just not the goal of my property. It's not the goal of my permaculture. And we do buy a lot of beans. We eat a lot of beans here, but I'm not able to grow all of our own supply. I don't strive for self-sufficiency. I talk about that extensively on this channel. My goal is community interdependence and supporting local food economies. So no, we don't grow all our own beans, but I do grow a good chunk of beans for soup or cassoulet. And that's where I want to talk a little bit about approachable goals in the garden, setting really achievable goals for yourself so that you can have success and want to continue gardening. My personal goal with growing pole beans is to grow enough for one meal for 6 people. So I want to grow enough for a cassoulet, for a big pot of stew that we can enjoy as a family in the dead of winter, usually New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. That way it feels like a special ritual. It feels like a special meal that we grew, that we harvested, and that we are enjoying as a family. But it's a realistic goal. So it may seem like a little anachronistic, like, oh, are you playing at being a farmer? No, I'm not. My goal has never been to produce all of our own food. I don't think that's realistic for most people. I think that farmers are an intrinsic and undervalued and incredibly important part of our society. And I think that it's totally okay to say my goal is going to be to source some of my own food off my own property, and I can judge for myself, my space, my time commitment, my realistic expectations of what that's going to look like. And for me, that's one meal for our family. So typically off of one structure in the garden and several bean plants, that typically is one meal of dried beans. Keep in mind, we're also eating green beans off of it throughout the summer as well. So again, I'm always wanting to encourage you all to feel that permaculture is accessible for you, feel that gardening is accessible for you. And I think that this is a crucial element in it being accessible, is that it is successful, that you feel good about it, you get a yield. Permaculture principle number 3, produce a yield. You decide what that yield is going to look like, what's attainable for you. And you get that yield, you feel more successful. It creates a feedback loop, a positive feedback loop in which you are enjoying the food that you grow and you want to grow more of it instead of feeling this horrible crushing weight of, oh no, I didn't produce, 50 pounds of beans out of my garden this year. I'm a failure. Hey, I produced enough for one wholesome, nutritious meal that I grew in my backyard for my family. I'm a success, right? So I think for your gardening and my gardening, it's really, really important to keep that focus in mind. Helps us keep pushing forward toward living a more sustainable life when we set goals that we can achieve. So how do you know when your pole beans are ready to harvest? Well, you look for them to be this kind of straw color instead of green anymore, and they have this kind of hollow sound to them, like a rattle. They feel kind of crunchy to the touch. That's a great indicator that your beans are ready to harvest. Now, we're in a drought here in Portland, but I don't water my plants at all. If you are somebody who waters your garden, you really should stop watering your pole beans in August so that it helps push them to mature. I've talked about that with tomatoes as well. When you stop watering a plant, it helps it get a little boost of stress that helps it try to mature its offspring. And so that's really important with beans. Also, especially overhead watering beans in August and September means that you are spraying the pods that are trying to dry out with water, and you're really encouraging the growth of mold on your pods, so you don't want to do that. Luckily for me, it hasn't rained here in forever, and so I don't have to worry about the rain causing that problem. But in past years, I have had that be an issue where we've had rains come early and I've gotten some mildew on the outside of my bean pods. And sometimes you can get this white fuzzy mold on the inside as your beans are not yet dry. And so it can really be a problem. So for me, sometimes if I know there's a bunch of rain in the forecast, I see that my beans are starting to get to be a straw color, but they're not totally dried out, I will pick them anyway, shell them, and then I will lay the beans out on a screen to dry in my kitchen or in my this room here, which is really like my sunroom. And that way they can dry in the house where I know that they're not going to get rained on excessively and they're not going to get mildewy and I'm not going to lose my whole crop. Sometimes you will get a little bit of black mildew on the outside of the dry pod and the beans inside are still totally fine. The concern is when the beans on the inside are not completely dried out and you get this kind of white fuzzy fungus that ruins your entire crop. So I'm picking my beans now, obviously very dry here, we're in a drought. And so they've dried really, really nicely themselves on the vine. The vines still have a bunch of green leaves, but it's time to pick the pods because they are that dry color. And we do have rain coming up this week, I hope. So the leaves of the beans are still really green, and I actually cut those and I feed them to the ducks and chickens. Ducks love bean leaves. So I'm getting a double yield. I'm getting a yield of poultry food, and I'm also getting a yield of the beans. Actually a triple yield because they're also fixing nitrogen in the soil. So I'm getting like a triple whammy there. It's great to grow pole beans for that reason. I get so many layers of yields out of them. In harvesting my pole beans, you may notice that in this giant bowl here, there's a little bit of stem left on the parts that I harvested. And that's because I actually go through with pruners and I clip them. And the reason I do that is because sometimes they don't separate very well from the stem. And in trying to pull and tug them off, you get that springing action where the bean pops open and the beans go flying. So I find I have less wastage if I actually go through and I clip the whole hand of beans. See, like this. I clip each individual cluster off, and that means that I'm not losing any beans through pulling and having the pod snap open and spray beans all over the garden. So I have my dry beans, and then I want to go ahead and shell them, and I want to lay them out for a day or two just to make sure they're really, really dry, and then I store them in a glass jar. I think it's really crucial when you are harvesting your beans, you don't wait too long, not only because the rains can come in and damage them, but also because at some point your beans will try and disperse themselves. They will try and fling their beans around the garden, and then you've lost them all. So what you get is the beans, if you've ever grown like sweet peas, they do this too. If you wait too long, the pods get dry enough that they actually twist like this and pop the beans, and the beans go spring everywhere. So you really, really want to pick these before you get to that state, so you don't lose any all over the ground so that squirrels and rodents and birds end up picking them all up. So pick them when they're straw colored, a little bit rattly, but before they're so dried out that they end up popping their pods. So again, lay the beans out for a day or two, put them in a jar. They'll keep for years in a dark place. You can either use them to replant or you can enjoy them in soups and stews in the winter. So I just want to encourage you that if you set those realistic goals for your gardening, you're going to feel successful. You're going to enjoy your gardening experience so much more. You're going to enjoy your permaculture so much more. Slow, small solutions. So when you're looking to obtain a yield, look to obtain a yield that's achievable. Now, maybe you're up for growing 50 pounds of beans every year. Maybe your goal is, I don't want to have to buy beans. I want to be self-sufficient in my bean production. That's an awesome goal. But maybe you want to be like me and say, I just want to grow 1 meal's worth or 1 week's worth of soup beans a year. Do what feels attainable for you. Do what gives you success and helps reinforce that permaculture is achievable, it's doable. So you don't have to go whole hog on everything. Maybe for you, your goal is like mine, where self-sufficiency is not something that you're looking for. You're looking for community interdependence, and you're looking for some measure of growing a quantity of your own food. I think those are really, really good goals to have, obviously because I have them myself, but I think it makes it so that you are going to be more successful and you're going to continue to strive forward in your permaculture when it feels positive and when it is something that works for you, right? Make the system work for you. Setting goals is a way you can make the system of permaculture work for you. So thank you for watching. If you got something out of this video, please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe. You can also check out my Patreon down in the description if you would like to support this channel every month. That is a fantastic way that you can help me continue to make more videos. Thanks.